Alright, so the game is The Halls of Montezuma. This is by the same team that put out 30 Years War, Europe in Agony, which I actually enjoyed quite a bit. I think I got this before that, but I haven't gotten around to playing it. This is, again, a CDG style game, and it looks... So, first of all, I want to say, I'm going to try to cover some of the rules here, but I've plowed through them, I think a total of at least twice, maybe 3 times now, and I just don't have a feel. I was in this place with some other games before, things like Empire of the Sun, where I had a lot of trouble getting my head around the game. I kind of get some of the basic mechanisms. They're not too different from other CDGs. But there's a lot of other stuff going on this, and I don't feel like I can go through the complete rules at this point. Maybe somewhere within, after I start getting a feel for the game, I can give you better about that. I'm not going to aim for that in this overview. All right, so first impression. Well, very pretty map, but here's one of the problems that I've found, and I haven't played this yet, so it's hard to tell. But with most CDG style games, well, let's get away from CDGs here. With most point-to-point movement games, because that's the real issue here, these little bubbles on the map. Most of them have these bubbles really prominently displayed, and it makes playing the game a little easier, but it makes for an ugly map. The only other one I played with a very, very pretty map was Clash of Monarchs, and I found it very difficult to see what was going on. Here it's definitely a pretty map. I think it may be a little easier to see the connections and what's going on here than in that game. I think the design choices on this one were much, much nicer. We'll see how it works out. Let's take a look at what the map kind of represents. First of all, it doesn't just have regular spaces, which are kind of cities. It also has these transit spaces. Something else had them. I don't remember what. But anyway, they're places where you have to pay to go through, but you can't actually fight in them, and you can't stop in them for the most part. Well, you can't stop in them, but you can make normal spaces into them, and I'm not quite sure. The rules don't really handle that situation very nicely. Raids can cause them... can cause a normal space to become a transit space. Now, they can happen while there are troops there, and then the troops obviously are still there as far as I can tell. There's also some off-map boxes. Baja and Alta California, New Orleans up here, Yucatan. And these are just larger areas. I think New Orleans is impassable to the Mexicans. This is mainly a war, or a game, about the Mexican War itself, but it starts a little before the war. And in particular, it's starting in this build-up era. Santa Anna is currently in exile, I believe. I don't know a terrible much about the history in the period. I have, the broad overview, but not much more than that. So it's kind of difficult for me to really place this nicely. All I know about Santa Anna, beyond, the obvious with the Alamo and then some of his, his rise and fall from power. After this war, he was arrested and brought to trial, and he introduced chewing gum, essentially, to America. But that's just kind of, that may be a legend for all I know, but I read it somewhere. Anyway, let's get back to the game. What do you get? Well, beyond this map, you also have these... spaces that indicate control of various Mexican states. And in each case, at the beginning of the game, they're held with a little Mexican flag. And then in everything except the Yucatan's case, which is in revolt, everything's calm, indicating there's no revolts going on, basically. Revolts are kind of an impediment to both players when they're happening. They're certainly a pain to the Mexicans because they can lower the Mexicans' political will. And that's what this game is about. It's about lowering the political will. That much I'm able to get there. It's a single political will, which may be a little weird because the U.S. certainly by the end of this war, was questioning whether they really should have been in the war in the first place. And that's not really tracked terribly well. What is tracked is the United States bellicosity, which is how they get brought into the war, but how the U.S. gets out of the war is actually handled by kind of a random game end. If the war starts stretching on too long, there's a chance the game might simply end on any turn, I think, starting with turn 6. And oddly enough, I think the war isn't guaranteed to start until turn 7. So there's this possibility, and it's actually very easy for the game, the way the game end mechanic is worded, from what I understand in the role, it's easier for the game to end early, turn 6, say. So it's quite possible the war may not even break out if the U.S. isn't able to push it to that point. And they can. In particular, they can declare war any turn they like at a cost in political will, which activates and mobilizes the Mexicans. All right. What else do we have here? We have a lot of different information here. The rulebook itself looks like it's well organized, but it doesn't really give me a feel for the game. And that's where my worry is here. I'll touch on it a little bit. It comes with a setup and a quick start guide to give you some of the sort of key elements of the game. I feel like this is almost largely designed for someone who's never played a CDG before. And to tell you the truth, this is one of the harder ones I've had to approach, and they're all kind of tricky at this, except for the very simple ones. You also get a couple of these player aid cards, which are filled with charts. Lots and lots of information here. And maybe we'll touch on them as we go. You get 2 sets of turn record tracks, which is kind of useful because one of them you've got counters on, and the second one can be used kind of as a reference. Maybe that's not intended. I didn't look in the manifest to see if you're supposed to get 2, but what's kind of nice about it is there's all kind of information on each turn. It's nice to have a sheet that you can pick up and look at. You also get this card, which is sort of a reference telling you about the cards themselves, and there is a little bit of difference here. We got 2 different decks of cards. They're not one per player. There's a shared deck, and there's actually a time factor in here. If we go over here, once the U.S. enters the war, a lot more cards get added to the events. And the events will look like they operate very much like normal CDG cards. You got your ops, you got your event. One player can play the event by the color, or perhaps both could play it as an event. And either one can use it as an operations card. So even if you get a good card that's your opponent's, it doesn't bone you. You still have a large operations points, except the operations points don't appear to be as flexible as in some of the games. We'll take a look at that in a moment. So this would be a Mexican-only card. It's got a response, which means the event itself can be used as a reaction, I believe in battle in that case. And then some of the cards can be removed, or forced to be removed. But this other set, the action cards, well, these are events too. More random events, things the players shouldn't control. A bunch of those are drawn at the beginning of each turn to determine kind of the events that affect the turn. Also, there are non-random events tailored across here. Some of these are going to have die roll charts that might affect anywhere on the map. It's an interesting little mechanic, but that deck's not just used for that. Whenever you activate a unit, you get to look at the strategic rating of a general in order to see what kind of movement allowance his force is going to have. Nothing too exciting here with the numbers. You have the strategic rating first, and I believe lower is better there, as is usual. And I think you need an operations card of at least their strategic rating. A fairly common mechanic used here again, except there's this kind of added thing of you don't know how far you're going to get him until you draw another card. A lot of randomness into that. The middle number is his force size, how many troops he can take with him in a command. And the final number is kind of his tactical battle rating. You've also got the American fleet on both the West Coast and the East Coast. And they become active, I think it's on turn 4, but maybe some cards can activate that. Yeah, maybe I'm mistaken. I don't know. At some point or another, the U.S. fleet becomes automatically active. I thought it was turn 4. It may not be in that chart. All right. Let's look at the sequence of play, and there's a nice example of it here on the card. And so the first thing that happens is a random events phase. That's when you draw a pile of the action deck to just see what happens. Some random crap that really isn't controlled by the players. Although each player draws some cards, and the player who drew it might be affected differently from the other player by it. For example, one might give reinforcements to just one player, the drawing, or it may differentiate who gets what. You're only allowed one set of reinforcements from the action deck, and if the card doesn't have any effect, it's discarded and you draw another one to replace it. In terms of if it doesn't have any effect because of the reinforcement rule. Okay. Before you do that, you implement whatever specific effects there are, events for that turn. There's also a chance if Santa Anna has come back and then been exiled again. Yeah, he had an interesting life. You start rolling for his return because he can kind of wander in and out of this war. And then the U.S. player has his option to declare war. Doing so boosts Mexico's political will. The later in the game, by a lesser and lesser amount. But if you do it early in the game, it seems almost like you're pushing for war a little too hard. Then each player gets a pile of strategy cards, and this again is determined. You get more once you're at war. It goes up to like a 9 card hand each. Once the Mexican government collapses, they get less, but in the early stages of the war, it's actually limited. I believe here there's a line that indicates how many cards you get. And things will automatically go to war at some point. Turn 7, as I said. Okay. Then you alternate your strategy cards. And you can play them as events. You can play them for operations. And once you're down to 1, you can discard them. And once you're down to 1, you can hold it. And by holding it, you're saying, I'm reserving the right to play this. If my opponent plays a card and I need another action, I can use it there. Or, if I don't want to, or if he passes on a hold card or whatever, I can hold this till next turn because it's important enough for that. It doesn't increase your hand size, but it does give you a card that maybe you think is very valuable that you don't want to play on a particular turn, whatever. There's a number of different actions. Let's go through what they are. Activating leaders, units, forces. Okay. And in this, you can do some things like suppressing revolts as a part of movement, essentially. Establishing control of a zone. If you're sitting in a place, you can flip in a zone. You can flip control of it. I believe you have to have more troops than the opponent for that to happen. I'm not positive. And you do that simply by... Whee. Okay. You can resolve a siege. I'm trying to remember. Don't remember if that happens at the end of movement. Something I'm going to have to look up there. And, well, at the end of your movement, you can engage in battle. Now, if the opponent's in a fortification, I think that resolves as a siege, but I'm not absolutely certain how that ends up working. Okay. You could instead, as in most of these, play the card as an event. And at the beginning of the game, the Mexican player is going to get this bonus Texas event. I think it's Texas' statehood. I didn't look it up. They have this in their hand no matter what, and they're allowed to drop U.S. bellicosity, get an additional unit. That's something else. Your force pool is in a cup. And there aren't very many U.S. units. Well, once they go to war, they get a few more. Your force pool's in a cup, and you're allowed to, whenever you get reinforcements, you basically draw from the cup, and you could get very, very different types of troops. Again, a lot of randomness here. Okay, and what else happens to them? Yes, their extra unit goes over into the disputed zone, which is kind of an interesting place. It has some effects on political will. By the Mexicans having more forces in there than the U.S., they get a boost in political will the first time it happens. Not quite sure how much other effect it has, except as being a real big transit area where you can move to the West Coast very easily. The U.S. is coming out of Texas, and this is their only way to get into the Californias. Well, other than marching the slow way over the map. All right, placing control markers, kind of like a Washington's War type game. If you're sitting in a circle, you can put yourself a little flag there and flag the area, and that gets it in control. Why do you want to do this? Well, in any particular state, if the Americans get up to this number, at the end of the turn, they can get control of that state. One weird little thing in the map is there's one state that has there's two states that share one box. It's kind of an annoyance. You'll also notice there's all these colors for the different states. As far as I can tell, that's just to distinguish so that, it's certainly important here, but it's to distinguish which state is which, and there's no real clear connection between the colors on the map and the colors in those boxes. They look like they'll work, but mainly it's kind of trying not to have too many too close to each other so that it's easier to distinguish what's what on the board, I guess. Okay. And you can build fortifications. There's two different kinds of fortifications in the game, and this is kind of cute too. When you build a fortification, this is just a field works. On the back, there's a number, a bonus, a defensive bonus. And there's a second kind of fortification, which is fortresses, which also work the same way. You'll see there's a number on the back and a question mark on the front. To build fortresses, you have to upgrade field works, and it takes actually it takes one card play to put down field works, it takes one to start building fortifications, and one to finish building them. And only when they're finished do they actually have any additional effect. So it's an expensive task to build fortifications. If you're planning a big, fast maneuver through the board, it's obviously not going to work. All right. And then there's the replacement points, which you can place using cards. I believe you're only allowed to do this once in each turn. Once you do it, you flip this over and say, hey, I did my replacements. Again, similar to Washington's War, where you get one reinforcement card. And then you could also restore the baggage train with a card play. And some of these require a certain number of card to do it. I'm not sure if the baggage train does. A lot of them are just, hey, any number card. The baggage train is going to help your supply, help extend your supply a little bit. Let's see. And supply is another weird facet in this game. This game is adding a lot of new ways of doing things to my mind. And it's like part of me is grasping all the little pieces. The big picture doesn't look that terribly hard, but it's hard to get a grip on any of the individual pieces. because it is very different from other games that I've seen. Okay, another option is to make naval moves, conduct amphibious landings, and activate squadron seas of port. Okay, most of those are US only. The Mexicans are allowed to do some naval movement, however, if the US fleet is either inactive or busy seizing a port. Amphibious invasions require the use of Marines, and this chart is really helpful, I think, in terms of figuring out, hey, what's what here? So like Marines, well, they're wartime only, so I don't have any yet. Kind of hard to be sure what I have and what I don't in any given place. So for example, here, I've got these artillery, but I got these things. And they're clearly not Marines. I don't know. I don't know if it matters too much what they are. Like there's special distinguishment of light infantry for the Mexicans, but I think that's just a setup aspect of the game. All right. And let's see what else we have here. So, other than actually doing an amphibious landing, and for the most part you're not allowed to use armies for this, you're just allowed to activate a small force and send it in someplace. But the Winfield Scott Invades card allows you to make essentially the Veracruz landing. You can organize an army. Armies give you, from what I can see, a mixed effect. They're better in combat. We got one up here, Army of Observation. It's got +3 force points for combat, but it's slower moving. I believe it has some other effects too. Again, I can't grasp everything on this well enough to explain it. Raid spaces or hide reveal a gorilla. Okay, now I'm not sure how you get gorillas. I tried reading the rules and had one mistaken impression. As far as I can tell, they come somehow from the cards magically. Maybe the events or whatever. Once they're on the board, they're kind of like normal troops, except they can't be led around in forces. But for the proviso that one leader, Canales, can lead the guerrillas, and he can lead only 3 guerrillas. That's all he's good at. He's the guerrilla general. Beyond that, though, you can tuck them away into a hidden place. I'm not sure where they go when they're hidden. But they're off map somewhere, and the Mexican player can play a card, any card, to bring them in the midst of a battle. Now, generally it looks like they're best in a defensive battle. And what they do is they make the Americans, they don't actually fight as far as I can tell, but they make the Americans fight while out of supply in that case. And that seems, if the Americans are attacking. And that seems like a very, very potent effect. If we get to the combat, we'll be able to look at that a bit. And then you can discard or hold a card, which I kind of explained before. Now, some of these cards are supplier logistics events. Some of them are automatically that way. And they just force a supply occurrence. And then you make a supply check. If your units are out of supply, they suffer rather badly, it looks like half their force. But some of them are ops cards that if you play them, I think it's only if you play them as an event. No, it doesn't matter which way you play it. I'll look that up to be sure, but I'm not positive. But you roll a die, and if you get less than or equal to the ops value, i.e. the higher valued card, is more likely to trigger a supply occurrence. So you have a very little control here, and very little knowledge of how many supply effects are going to happen. You want to maintain your line, but you also kind of want to push forward. And the supply lines don't look terribly long. I think they're like 5 movement points. Now, movement points are fairly reasonable. It costs nothing to actually make most connections, but the spaces themselves have movement points. Complicated system here to keep everything in mind, right? Because rougher jungle spaces have their own movement point cost and force people to stop. Different connections can add to that movement point cost. You can consider them kind of the equivalent to hex side additional costs. And I'll load this up and come back. All right. Replacements. They have their own cost per step based on the cost of the value of the card. That's not where I was. I just wanted to confuse you. No, but I'm showing you some of the effects here of these massive, massive amounts of charts. For example, this is the chance the Mexican government collapses. When you conquer cities, they have a modifier. These are political will markers for cities. Well, if the Americans conquer Mexican cities, when it happens, or vice versa, you roll a die with that modifier to see whether or not any political will swings in the favor of the person who captures it. Chance of a war being declared, when does that happen? They get a roll during one stage in the game, so they might enter without paying and without a card. All the different effects that can cause changes in the Mexican will. This is during battle. There's a potential of leaders being lost. On 2 chances out of 10 in the combat roll. This is a pursuit chart. Let's go to the battle itself, though, because in a lot of ways that's the meat of a war game, right? I mean, when it comes down to it, you maneuver around, but something like this, actually maneuvering looks fairly limited, but actually the battles are as well. From what I can understand, for the most part, the battles are not terribly decisive. Supply may be. Okay, so what do? Well, it's based on how many strength points or how many firepower points you have. But that's not determined by how many units you bring with you. The firepower is actually determined by adding up specific units. Now, each person has to put forward a lead unit. That's the main fighting unit. And its full strength, whatever that is, and those don't go very high. I think the highest are 3s. Its full strength is the firepower it adds. Then you're allowed to commit units, and each leader has stars, 1 or 2. Kearney has 1. That's how many units you're allowed to commit. Committed units are going to take damage no matter what. For each unit you commit, you get to add double its strength in firepower. Each additional unit just adds 1, no matter what, even active militia. So active militia, no matter what, are kind of weak. They're going to only add a half point each there. Combined arms, if you have everything, cav, infantry, and artillery, you get a +1 bonus. That's not a lot. If you have an army organization, it gives you +3. If you're out of supply, including if the Americans moved in and just had a guerrilla popped on them, it's -3. The cards, well, the attacker and then the defender is allowed to play, I think, 2 cards to affect the battle. And those can add to the firepower conceivably. Okay, die roll field command, 1 officer per battle. Ah, yes. So, the U.S. has some specific leaders, including Lee, Grant, Jackson, and Beauregard, who at one point or another provided a lot of power, a lot of good information or morale boost or whatever to the U.S. forces by some daring do or another. And by using them, and they're brought into the game with cards, you get a bonus to your total firepower. The attacker, however, has to pay movement points to fight. And those movement points are based on, well, the amount of movement points you have to play, up to 3 for a pitched attack. But if it's less than that, it causes a penalty to the attacker's firepower. If there's an interception, you're required to use hasty attack. Column of rout is usually when you're accidentally somehow attacking. And the defender also has some bonuses to terrain. And the zapadores are the sappers, and the fortresses themselves you consider to be a terrain factor. But here's the thing, that's not enough. Alright, you're also going to be affected by, as in most games, a die roll for combat, and that die roll is modified by your tactical rating. Kearney has a 1. All these other leaders on the board right now have a 0. Not much good out there at this point. Okay. So, if we look at the battle procedure, the attacker pays his cost for the movement. Cavalry and guerrilla, or for the attack as part of movement. Cavalry and guerrillas, if that's all there is in a force, they can just withdraw from the battle. And then the attacker can keep moving if he has movement points, and they can attack presumably the same units, which only withdrew 1 space. Mexican's allowed to play a card, and if he has a guerrilla in hiding, he can bring him into play into the combat. The attacker and the defender designate their lead and commitment units. Then you calculate the force points as I explained. The efficiency die roll, well, that's modified by the tactical rating of 1 leader. Doesn't matter who, doesn't have to be the overall commander. And some other bonuses. On an interception, you get a bonus. If you're an army, you get a bonus. If the defender attempted to avoid the battle. Now, before the withdrawal, there's an option to try to avoid the battle. And like many of these games, it's pretty much the same die roll as interception, based on the strategic rating. If you have the chief of staff, one of the field commanders essentially, Lee, Grant, Beauregard, or Jackson, you're able to add 1 for that. And if you roll a natural 2 or 7, you have to roll in the leader loss table for each of your leaders that's present. The Mexican player can lose artillery off this roll. The efficiency die roll is then compared to determine how efficient you are. Well, that doesn't really matter. What it comes down to is you compare the number you roll to the amount of fire points you have. And that's how many step losses you generate. Alright, well, what happens after that? There's restrictions to the losses, which are going to be, well, first off, committed units each take a step loss for being committed. That's their cost, and it could destroy them if they only had 1 step. But they don't count. There's going to be additional losses from here, and these are the ones that count. And like many of these games, there's restrictions on what you can take. Everything has to take a step loss before anything can be destroyed. That includes you can't even take your first step loss on a weaker unit. Within these restrictions, the owner distributes their losses at discretion. Possible leader loss. But then, if the attacker does well enough, I don't remember what the definition of that is, total step loss difference is 5 or more. Now they say count all here. I don't know if that counts committed units. You roll a die and modify it by the type of battle. The difference in steps can cause a difference. If you roll a 9, things are really bad. You've totally pursued the broken enemy. But if you roll less than a natural 9, if you don't roll a natural 9, if you roll anything else, you look on here and see how many additional step losses you do to the opponent. On a natural 9, you do much worse, and essentially you chase them. They have to go back to an in-supply space, and they take half losses, I think, or 3, whichever is more. Anyway, it's very painful. If you've got the enemy surrounded and you force them to retreat, they're just destroyed. I don't know how likely that is in most cases. All right. And then you conduct retreats. And then you get political will. And political will comes from a lot of these different things that can cause points. For example, it says here, win battle if enemy forces an army. That's 1. But you can also get 1 if the enemy force has 5 or more units engaged. So, you see, I'm assuming they're all cumulative. But most games are a little clearer about that than this feels like it is. Anyway, yeah, it says all are cumulative, so that's pretty clear. So, when the U.S. wins points, it's dropping the Mexican political will. As the Mexicans win points, it rises it. Now, political will is important. And somewhere we have the Mexican collapse table. I saw it in here. Each turn, the Mexican's going to roll a die and modify it. He doesn't have to worry about this if Santa Anna is currently president. And it's modified by all these sort of effects, bad things that are happening by U.S. actions. And if the roll goes up at least a 10, well, then it gives +1 to the next collapse. But if it's a 16 or higher, the Mexican government collapses. And that's bad. Because if the Mexican government's collapsed, the victory point burden becomes higher. The Mexicans pretty much just have to make it through this until the U.S. withdraws from the war without totally losing their national will. But if the government's collapsed, the national will at 10 becomes a problem. Now let's look at what the automatic victory conditions are, if I can find them. There's a nice little index here, which is useful, but it doesn't say winning or victory or anything like that, which is a shame. So it's not as nice as one would hope. Hold on a moment. So the rules are nicely organized in terms of a lot of cross-referencing. Unfortunately, the concepts just don't sink into my brain as well because they are very different in this game. I actually like the rules organization here, but this is such a different game from what I faced that it's like learning wargaming all over again. All right, so political will and victory, here's a number of things that affect it, and they're all listed on that nice little chart. But victory in particular, sudden death. The U.S. wins if they get Veracruz, Mexico City, Saltillo, Alta California, and Monterrey, and have more units up here in the disputed zone. That's a lot to take. But if they can get all of that, they get an automatic victory. Mexico wins if Mexico occupies 5 or more of Texas and has at least 1 leader and 2 more units than the U.S. in the disputed zone. If Mexico's positioning itself in that kind of way, they're going to be able to force the U.S. out of this war. Okay. Well, if that doesn't happen, there's political will victory, which is at the end of a turn. Remember what I said? There's a roll to see if the game ends. Well, I think it's starting on turn 6, maybe 7. Game ends on a roll of a 9. Game ends on an 8 or 9. Okay, so this is opposite of what is written in the rules. And I think this is probably the correct version. The way the rules are written, if you roll higher than the turn number, you end up ending the game, and that's no good. That makes it end early. So I said something about that. When I look here, it's very obvious that it follows what makes sense. And the rule is kind of weirdly worded, but seems pretty specific that it does the opposite of what's stated in there. All right, and there's a lot of cases where I've felt like I need to look at the charts and play with the pieces to get a really good clue of what's going on. And you're going to see me do that as you go, or, well, wait till the review and just say, I don't want to watch him blundering through. Either way. All right. So the game can end at the end of any turn starting with turn 6. And at that point, if the game does end, if the Mexicans have at least 1 point of political will, they win unless the government has collapsed. If the government has collapsed, all the U.S. has to do is get them down to 10. All right. Let's look at supply sources because I've got a little bit more time and I think supply is going to be the key with this game. I really do. So, your supply source is going to be, for the United States, anything in Texas or a port or a zone that the player controls. Now, in those cases, you can only supply limited amounts of forces. So from a zone, I think it depends on the zone, but in general, let's see what this says. May revolt 1 unit per side is automatically in supply. 3 units per side are in supply. Something's allowed to supply 1 outside of there. The disputed zone, this is kind of worded weirdly, but you're able to trace supply through it. I don't think Yucatan gives you supply, but ports, the U.S. is allowed to support 1 force that's not an army through a port. They're also allowed to place the beachhead, though. And somewhere or another I have that marker. Here it is. And that becomes a supply source sufficient to supply an army, which is important, and that's essentially what Veracruz was used as. For Mexico, it's a friendly political will city, 1 with a point, a zone. Sonora State, up here, up to 3 Mexican units are in supply during the supply event. They just have to be there. They don't actually trace. And the Mexican baggage train and the U.S. baggage train can also be used as one. The baggage trains just extend supply, though. They still have to trace to somewhere else. And what you're going to be doing is tracing a line, up to 5 spaces, not movement points. Great. Okay. But the spaces have to be clear or non-clear with either fortifications or the baggage train. They can't have been raided unless a unit or the baggage train is there. And they can't be in revolt unless the baggage train is there. A lot of complexity to how you're going to keep your supply lines settled. And then there's specifics here. 1 port per coast as a U.S. force supply. 3 units are in supply in the disputed zone automatically. That's not what it says on the board. A player with at least as many units therein as the other player can trace a supply line through the disputed zone, which counts as 3 spaces, which is here. Okay. Alta and Baja California, 1 unit is in supply in each, but Alta California is a supply source for 1 force outside the zone. And this can be done by sea? I don't know. Now, the force that Alta California is supplying can be different for supply checks, which in particular is important because, yes, when you draw a supply event, a logistics event, you can only supply one force for that. But when you go into battle, Alta California can supply any force in a battle. So whoever you just activated can be supplied from Alta California, assuming you have the proper line there. What about the wagon? Yeah. The train can be sitting in any kind of space or transit space, and you supply in and out of the baggage space. It must trace its own supply back to a friendly supply source, and this can be the beachhead for the U.S. baggage train. Or a beachhead could trace to the baggage train, presumably extending it. That's not clarified. The baggage train can be captured, however, if it's caught alone, and then it causes a political will to switch hands, and comes back, what, 2 turns later or something? No, it re-enters. You have to play a strategy card, yeah, at any point. The beachhead is like an immobile baggage train in the port. Yeah. So, I guess we're going to take a look at it. I mean, obviously, I don't have a really good grasp on the rules, but I think I've given some feel for where I'm at, and maybe it'll help if you do follow this and you haven't played it. I know it's not a terribly popular game, actually, which is one reason I wanted to get at least some of the introduction and some of the rules into play, even if I don't feel comfortable with them yet. Alright, and I don't know. Well, let's give it a shot and see what it turns out as.